In April 1943, Japan was shocked when Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was shot down, marking a turning point in the South Pacific. This episode focuses on the Allied strategy to cut off Rabaul at its source. It stemmed from a rare agreement between General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral William Bull Halsey Jr. Their plan involved two prongs. Halsey advanced along the Solomon Islands while MacArthur moved through New Guinea towards the Huon Peninsula. They seized Kirrawheenah and Woodlark to extend fighter cover. You will witness the Battle of the Bismarck Sea and the first use of low-altitude skip bombing, which devastated Japanese supply lines. The campaign featured intense jungle warfare on New Georgia, the challenges faced by PT-109 in nighttime operations, and the decision to bypass strongholds like Kolombangara. The narrative also details the November landings on Bougainville, with the Seabees constructing airfields from mud and coral, and the airstrikes that rendered Rabaul ineffective. The story concludes with MacArthur's advances into New Britain and Cape Gloucester. It also looks east to the Central Pacific, where the assault on Tarawa exposes the brutal realities of attacking fortified atolls and the critical lessons learned for future amphibious operations. After the grueling battles to secure Guadalcanal and eastern Papua New Guinea, the Americans understood that taking out the Japanese stronghold at Rabaul would be a challenging task. The rivalry between MacArthur and the United States Navy added to the difficulty. However, when Admiral Halsey visited MacArthur at his headquarters in Brisbane, they surprisingly found common ground. In April 1943, they agreed on a plan. Halsey's forces would advance northwest from Guadalcanal along the Solomon Islands, while MacArthur's troops would eliminate Japanese forces in New Guinea and capture the Huon Peninsula across from New Britain. This coordinated effort aimed to encircle Rabaul. They also targeted the islands of Kirrawheenah and Woodlark to use as air bases. Meanwhile, the Japanese bolstered their defenses in Rabaul, New Guinea, and the western Solomon Islands, deploying 100,000 troops from Korea, China, and other regions. Their top priority was to strengthen Leh in the Huon Peninsula with the 51st Division. On March 1st, a Japanese convoy of 8 troop transports, protected by 8 destroyers, entered the Bismarck Sea near New Britain. B-17s from the 5th Air Force, supporting MacArthur, spotted the convoy. The 5th Air Force saw significant improvements under its new commander, General George C. Kenney. Kenney implemented reforms that included instructing his B-25 medium bomber crews to abandon high-level bombing. That tactic had shown to be ineffective against ships. Instead, the crews were to attack at low altitude, using newly mounted forward-firing machine guns to counter anti-aircraft gunners on the vessels. They would bounce their bombs just before reaching the ship's side. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea commenced with low-level assaults by Australian Bullfighters. This was followed by some high-level bombing, which resulted in one transport being sunk and several others being damaged. Japanese Zeros providing air cover were challenged by the recently arrived P-38 Lightnings, which outmatched them. Over the next 2 days, the convoy struggled across the Vitiaz Strait toward New Guinea. On the 3rd day, Kenney's crews put their new skip bombing technique to the test for the first time in combat. Following another strafing run by Beaufighters to eliminate anti-aircraft guns, the B-25s and A-20 attack planes executed their skip bombing. They used bombs with delayed fuses to ensure detonation inside the ships. The results were catastrophic. 7 remaining transports sank, along with 4 destroyers. Believing that Japanese forces would never surrender, fast PT boats and fighter aircraft targeted lifeboats and survivors in the water, resulting in about 3,000 deaths. With skip bombing, the United States discovered a lethal strategy for naval warfare, leaving Japan unable to reinforce or resupply its troops except through submarines or nighttime missions by destroyers. In many areas, Japanese soldiers faced starvation. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto intensified his efforts to bolster his forces in the region. He sent an additional 200 aircraft to Rabaul and Bougainville in the western Solomons, effectively doubling their strength. He even traveled to Rabaul to oversee operations. On April 17th, in the largest Japanese airstrike since the attack on Pearl Harbor, dive bombers, accompanied by Zeros, assaulted Guadalcanal and Tulagi. Over the following days, Japanese aircraft targeted Port Moresby and Milne Bay, located at the eastern tip of Papua. On April 14th, American forces intercepted a radio transmission indicating that Yamamoto would fly from Rabaul to Bougainville on April 18th. Admiral Chester Nimitz sought and received authorization from Washington for an ambush. They knew the time Yamamoto would arrive over Bougainville, so 18 twin-tailed P-38 Lightnings from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal were prepared and waiting. Most of the Lightnings focused on escorting 9 Japanese Zero fighters. Meanwhile, other pilots targeted 2 bombers, one of which was carrying Yamamoto. Lieutenant Thomas Lanfier managed to shoot the wing off the Admiral's aircraft, causing it to crash on the island. The other bomber fell into the ocean. Later, a squad of Japanese soldiers retrieved the charred body of the commander-in-chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy from the jungle. On June 5th, Yamamoto's ashes were given a state funeral in Tokyo. Operation Cartwheel, aimed at advancing on Rabaul, began on June 30th. A regiment from the 41st Division, under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, landed in New Guinea near Lae. Some landing craft became stuck in the rough surf. The noise of their engines revving and grinding to free themselves in the dark resembled the sound of tanks landing. Japanese troops retreated into the jungle, and a beachhead was quickly established. On the same day, American forces also landed on the islands of Kiriwina and Woodlark, located about 500 kilometers south of Rabaul. They faced no opposition and began constructing airfields. This allowed P-38 Lightning squadrons to reach the significant Japanese base easily. Additionally, Admiral William Halsey's ships landed 10,000 troops on New Georgia in the Solomon Islands, northwest of Guadalcanal. The Americans had greatly improved their landing techniques with more amphibious tractors and trucks known as DUKWs. They had strong air support from Guadalcanal, but the dense jungle on New Georgia turned out to be more challenging than expected. Soldiers of the 43rd Division, newly arrived, struggled with the exhausting and confusing jungle environment. They quickly grew anxious due to the night noises. One regiment took 3 days to cover just under a mile. Unfamiliar with jungle combat, they were easily harassed and frightened by small Japanese raiding parties based at Munda on the island's western tip. Before engaging in battle, nearly a quarter of the troops succumbed to combat fatigue. Halsey was forced to relieve commanders and bring in fresh troops, boosting the ground forces to 40,000 men. The slow pace of the advance allowed the Japanese to reinforce their positions at night, raising their numbers to 10,000. Rear Admiral Walden Ainsworth's initial effort to intercept the nighttime convoys was successful, resulting in the sinking of the Japanese flagship Jinsu. However, as his ships continued to chase, a destroyer was lost, and 3 cruisers sustained heavy damage from Japanese warships that utilized their effective long-lance torpedoes, far superior to the American options. During these night skirmishes, the fast torpedo boat PT-109, led by Lieutenant John F. Kennedy, was hit by a Japanese destroyer. Kennedy managed to get the survivors onto a nearby island. Thanks to an Australian coast watcher, they were rescued 6 days later. On August 6th, another night ambush by 6 American destroyers detected 4 Japanese destroyers carrying troops. The United States Navy waited until the targets were within range and launched 24 torpedoes. Only 1 destroyer escaped. The other 3 sank, taking with them 900 soldiers. The Japanese reinforcements that did reach New Georgia were involved in a triple counterattack, one of which surrounded the headquarters of the 43rd Division. A precisely targeted barrage from American artillery registered shells all around the perimeter, forcing the Japanese to retreat. The campaign for Munda proved much tougher than anticipated. The Japanese had built a network of hidden bunkers deep in the jungle. Eventually, through a mix of artillery, mortars, flamethrowers, and light tanks, the Americans destroyed the bunkers and captured the airfield at Munda on August 5th. The battle for New Georgia was a stark lesson, necessitating a numerical advantage of 4-1, along with significant sea and air support to secure the island. Halsey's staff, rattled by the time and resources required, reassessed their strategy. They concluded that instead of capturing every island along the Solomons in sequence, they could bypass heavily defended islands establish airfields farther ahead, and use air and naval power to isolate the remaining garrisons. Consequently, the next target became the lightly defended island of Vella La Vella, forcing the Japanese to abandon Kolombangara, which they had just reinforced. The primary focus on most newly secured islands was to build an airfield. Naval construction battalions, known as Seabees, cleared jungle by blasting it apart, leveled the ground with bulldozers, laid down steel strips called Marston mat, and topped it with crushed coral. They often arrived just after the first wave of Marines and could prepare a new landing site in less than 10 days. One officer described these tough and resourceful groups as smelling like goats, living like dogs, and working like horses. Their role in the Pacific War was significant. Meanwhile, in New Guinea, General Douglas MacArthur's American and Australian troops were moving toward the Japanese base at Lae. They aimed to capture the Huon Peninsula. The United States 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment parachuted onto the airstrip at Dadzab, west of Lae. The following day, C-47 transports began bringing in the 7th Australian Division. With the 9th Australian Division advancing from the east, the town was doomed. It fell to the Allies in mid-September. However, the Huon Peninsula proved to be a tougher challenge. The Japanese were determined to hold their position to protect Rabaul, located across the Vitiaz Strait. They were not forced off the coast until October, with another 2 months needed to dislodge them from the mountain areas. In November, Admiral William Halsey's forces landed on Bougainville, the last large island before Rabaul. The mangrove swamps, jungles, and mountain ranges presented an even greater challenge than those on New Georgia. Additionally, the Japanese garrison there consisted of 40,000 men and 4 airfields. Halsey began with diversionary attacks on nearby islands before landing 2 divisions on the west coast at a lightly defended location. He followed this up with heavy air assaults on Rabaul, destroying over 100 Japanese aircraft. The fast F-4U Corsair fighter was showing its effectiveness. The Japanese were losing many of their skilled pilots, and their Zero fighter, once a dominant force in 1941, had become outdated. After 2 days of raids, Admiral Koga Minachi, the new commander of the combined fleet, ordered all warships to withdraw from Rabaul to Truk, their main base in the Pacific, which was 1,300 kilometers to the north. General Hyakutake, commander of the 17th Army on Bougainville, believed the landing on the west coast was just another diversion and did not launch a counterattack. This allowed the Americans to create a strong defensive perimeter before Hyakutake realized his serious error. On December 15th, MacArthur's advance troops landed on the southern coast of New Britain. 11 days later, the 1st Marine Division, rejuvenated after a lengthy rest in Melbourne, landed at Cape Gloucester, the southwestern tip of the island. For MacArthur, this location was crucial as it would protect the side of his invasion route to the Philippines. The Marines landed on a black volcanic sand beach the day after Christmas. Their commander urged them, "Do not pull that trigger unless you have a target in sight, and when you do, make sure to spill blood." The rainy season brought mud, constant dampness, decay, leeches, and jungle rot. Patrols and skirmishes took place in rain so heavy that visibility was severely limited. After intense fighting, securing Hill 660, which overlooked the airfield, allowed Allied control of Cape Gloucester. Allies could now bomb Rabaul from multiple angles, though the Japanese fleet's departure had diminished its significance. However, MacArthur's forces still needed to clear the northern coast of New Guinea. As MacArthur moved closer to achieving his vision of glory in the Philippines, Nimitz began his advance toward Japan, taking one island at a time across the central Pacific. Nimitz's command included Vice Admiral Spruance's 5th Fleet, bolstered by fast fleet carriers of the Essex class, each carrying 100 aircraft, as well as Independence-class light carriers with 50 aircraft. This strong carrier force allowed the invasion of the Gilbert Islands, the first islands to be attacked, to proceed without needing ground-based air support. These low-lying atolls, adorned with little more than palm trees, seemed like perfect targets compared to the steaming jungles, swamps, and mountains of the larger southern Pacific islands. Yet planners underestimated the challenges posed by the surrounding coral reefs. On November 20th, the 2nd Marine Division attacked the Tarawa Atoll. 3 battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, and 20 destroyers bombarded Japanese positions in the landing strip. Intense airstrikes from dauntless dive bombers followed, greatly motivating the Marines watching the explosions. It appeared as if the entire island was being shattered. The low Japanese bunkers, constructed from concrete and palm trunks, were much tougher than the American commanders anticipated. The Amtraks and landing craft took significantly longer to reach the shore than intended. Once the bombardment ceased, a communication issue on the flagship USS Maryland resulted in a lengthy delay. This pause gave the Japanese time to recover from their initial shock and strengthen their defenses. A critical mistake was made by Admiral Turner, the stubborn task force commander. He dismissed warnings from a retired British officer about the island's tides. The officer, supported by the Marine commander, advised Turner that their landing craft lacked the necessary 4 feet of clearance at this time of year. The Amtraks that were part of the first wave managed to cross the reef, but were met with intense gunfire. Confined by a low seawall, they became easy targets for Japanese infantry who threw grenades. One Marine, used to playing baseball, caught 5 grenades before the 6th one blew off his hand. The landing craft that followed got stuck on the reef and faced the same deadly fire. A chaotic shuttle service began with the surviving Amtraks operating between the beach and the reef. Even the Marines who made it to the beach were pinned down by heavy gunfire. Their radios, soaked with seawater, failed, leaving no communication between the beach and the ships offshore. By nightfall, about 5,000 men had landed, but at a terrible cost of 1,500 casualties and disabled Amtraks. Corpses covered the beach, while others floated in the surf like debris. During the night, Japanese infantrymen moved into some of the wrecked Amtraks, and some swam to those in the bay to turn them into firing positions against the Marines. Machine gunners even took positions in a bombed-out Japanese freighter and fought from there. The same situation occurred the next dawn when reinforcements tried to land. Thankfully for the Marines, another battalion that had cleared the northwest shore soon received tank support. The tide of battle changed as the Marines began to clear bunker after bunker using explosives, gasoline, and flamethrowers, turning the defenders into nothing more than charred remains. Some were even buried alive in their bunkers when an armored bulldozer filled their firing slits with sand. The battle concluded on the 3rd day with a desperate mass charge rooted in the Gyokusai belief of death before dishonor. This was an effort to avoid capture. Marines cut down their attackers with fierce enthusiasm. Over the course of 3 days, nearly 5,000 Japanese soldiers and Korean construction workers lost their lives. However, the toll of securing such a small island, over 1,000 dead and 2,000 wounded, shocked American commanders and the public back home. They were horrified by images of deceased Marines. Yet these losses led to significant improvements for future operations. Underwater demolition teams were introduced, and armored vehicles were enhanced. There was also a comprehensive reassessment of communications and intelligence ahead of any additional landings. The limitations of bombing and naval artillery using high explosive shells were reconsidered as well. For bunkers like those found on Tarawa, armor-piercing ammunition was needed. In the spring of 1943, President Franklin D. Roosevelt and General George C. Marshall solidified their strategy for China. They favored an air campaign and rejected General Joseph Stilwell's proposals for strengthening Allied land forces in China to combat the Japanese there. Their primary focus was on building up Claire Lee Chennault's 14th Air Force on the Chinese mainland. Its mission was to expand to include attacks on Japanese shipping in the South China Sea and to raid Japanese supply bases, supporting the United States Navy in the Pacific. However, there was a flaw in this plan. Chennault's successes were likely to provoke a reaction from the Japanese. Without sufficiently strong Chinese forces to protect his airfields, the campaign of the 14th Air Force would falter. Chiang Kai-shek's forces in Yunnan were meant to be bolstered for this purpose, yet they received minimal weaponry. Most of the first 4,700 tons of supplies were designated for Chennault. Roosevelt's assurance that air transport over the Himalayas would deliver 10,000 tons a month was overly optimistic. In May, the Japanese launched their fourth offensive against Changsha in Hunan province, including an amphibious landing at Lake Tungting. An additional assault from southern Hubei indicated this was an encirclement operation to take control of a crucial rice-growing area. B-24 Liberator bombers from Chennault's 14th Air Force targeted Japanese supply bases and troop trains. The bombers, accompanied by fighter escorts, downed 20 Japanese aircraft, lifting the spirits of nationalist troops on the ground. Nationalist forces suffered greater losses than the Japanese. However, Chiang Kai-shek's troops managed to halt the Japanese advance from Hubei and pushed them back. In Shantung Province, located south of Peking, a nationalist Chinese division found itself under attack from both Japanese forces and Chinese communist units. The nationalist government in Chongqing ceased its relations with Vichy France. Meanwhile, the Wang Qingwei puppet government declared war on the United States and Britain. The Vichy regime had to relinquish France's concessions in China to Wang Qingwei. The large white Russian community in Shanghai, which had cooperated with the Japanese, grew increasingly despondent after the Soviet victory at Stalingrad. The Soviet regime, despised by many, appeared stronger than ever. The tide of the war was shifting in the Pacific and on the Eastern Front in a way they had not anticipated. The possibility of a communist Shanghai started to seem real. The Japanese forces had left Mao Zedong's troops in the northeast largely unbothered. If the Red Army arrived after Germany's defeat, the Chinese communists could take control. Diplomatic maneuvering continued. Tokyo announced that Burma would gain independence as part of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Its puppet government then declared war on Britain and the United States. In another move to assert their anti-colonial stance, the Japanese established an Indian National Army, led by Subhas Chandra Bose, with Indian prisoners of war recruited from Japanese camps. Stilwell's conflicts with Chennault grew even more intense that spring. Their disputes began to interfere with the war effort, much to the concern of Allied officers. Brooke criticized Stilwell as a hopeless crank with no vision, while he described Chennault as a gallant airman with limited intelligence. Stilwell also made an enemy of Chiang Kai-shek by wanting to extend support to the Chinese communists. Chiang was furious because Mao Zedong's communists refused to join the nationalist forces. Stilwell argued that they were fighting harder against the Japanese, further infuriating Chiang. British intelligence believed that the communists had formed an unofficial agreement with the Japanese. This arrangement allowed both sides to limit their operations against each other. Mao was conserving his lightly armed troops in preparation for the civil war that would inevitably follow the Japanese defeat. Chiang was doing the same. In May 1943, an attempt was made to resolve the conflict between Joseph Stilwell and Claire Chennault. Both were called to meet with President Franklin Roosevelt just before the Trident Conference in Washington. Roosevelt affirmed that Chennault's air offensive from China was the priority. However, he also permitted Stilwell to proceed with his campaign to reclaim northern Burma. The president had a habit of avoiding conflicts by allowing both strategies to move forward simultaneously, much like he did with Douglas MacArthur and the United States Navy in the Pacific. In July, Operation Buccaneer was proposed. This was a significant landing aimed at clearing the Japanese from the Bay of Bengal. Chiang Kai-shek supported this plan, but remained rightfully skeptical about the Allies' willingness to commit substantial ground forces in Southeast Asia. It was no surprise that he resented the idea of sending his troops to reclaim Burma, while the Americans and British regarded his forces in China as less important. Ultimately, a shortage of shipping led to the cancellation of Operation Buccaneer. Relations with Chiang Kai-shek soured further when, in mid-August, the Quadrant Conference in Quebec decided to establish Southeast Asia Command, with Vice Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten as the Supreme Allied Commander. Alan F. Brooke, who had little regard for Mountbatten's abilities, noted that he would require a very capable chief of staff to assist him, which he got in Lieutenant General Sir Henry Pownall. Yet, Mountbatten would also have as his deputy Joseph Stilwell, who held a deep dislike for him. Mountbatten was glamorous, charming, and skilled in public relations, leveraging his royal connections, but had risen through the ranks too quickly for a captain. Chiang Kai-shek was horrified to learn that his troops would be under British command in Burma. He considered requesting Stilwell's recall but changed his mind in October. He realized that without Stilwell, he might not have any American support for his forces in China. It is ironic that Mountbatten supported this change. He worried that recalling Stilwell would raise American press suspicions. They already joked that SEAC stood for Save England's Asian Colonies. Stalin would have found humor in the intense rivalries and personal grudges that complicated Allied strategy. Brooke felt horrified before the Quadrant Conference when Churchill suggested that Ord Wingate, who had just been promoted to brigadier, should take command of the army. Back in April, Churchill had dismissed the British plans for Burma, saying it was like eating a porcupine one quill at a time. Yet now, he was captivated by the idea of unconventional operations behind Japanese lines. Wingate was a fundamentalist Christian and an ascetic visionary, often compared to Peter the Hermit by General Slim. He was no fraud. He was likely a manic depressive, having previously attempted to commit suicide by cutting his own throat. He was a difficult individual, known for pushing his men hard and being merciless to the wounded, yet he was equally tough on himself. With his beard, disheveled appearance, and a sola tapi that looked oversized, he did not fit the typical image of a senior officer in the Royal Artillery. His habits included wandering around without clothes, chewing raw onions, straining tea through his socks, and wearing an alarm clock around his neck. He gained recognition as a master of irregular warfare by organizing Jewish special night squads in Palestine to counter Arab assaults and by leading Gideon Force in Ethiopia. Churchill had always embraced unconventional ideas, and it seemed Wingate could help break the deadlock in northern Burma. In India in 1942, Wingate proposed to Wavell that columns, supported by airdrops and operating in the Japanese rear, would be instrumental for disrupting enemy supply lines and communications. In February 1943, he got his opportunity to prove his theories. With the 77th Brigade divided into two groups, which in turn were split into columns, Wingate's forces crossed the River Chindwin. Each unit included a reconnaissance group from the Burma Rifles and carried rations, ammunition, machine guns, and mortars on pack mules. By the third week of March, most of Wingate's Chindit columns had crossed the Irrawaddy River. However, maintaining radio contact became increasingly challenging. Organizing supply drops was also difficult as two Japanese divisions chased them, forcing constant movement. Lacking food, they resorted to slaughtering mules, which resulted in abandoning much of their heavy equipment. Wingate's forces soon had to retreat. They had failed to cut the Mandalay to Lashio Road and lost nearly a third of the original 3,000 men. Discipline was enforced harshly, with several instances of flogging and even executions. Many wounded and sick soldiers were left behind. Among those who returned, quite a few were exhausted, suffering from fever and half-starved. 600 of them were unfit for further duties for several months. Although this extensive mission was not a success, it did boost morale for Slim's 14th Army and the public back home, thanks to highly optimistic reports. Important lessons emerged, particularly regarding the necessity of establishing proper dropping zones and even landing strips in the jungle. Once the Allies could offer adequate transport and air support, similar operations were expected to yield better results. Still, this initial long-range incursion had a more significant consequence. It prompted the Japanese to plan a major offensive for the spring of 1944, which would lead to pivotal battles in the Burma campaign. Rarely has an enemy offensive been as apparent as the Germans' Operation Citadel, intended to encircle the Soviet salient around Kursk. Stalin's commanders believed the Germans could only manage one major attack, and the Kursk bulge was clearly the weakest point in their defenses. Zhukov and Vasilevsky successfully convinced their eager leader that the best approach was to prepare for this double strike, defend against it, and then transition to an offensive strategy themselves. The German buildup in April 1943 was meticulously monitored by aerial reconnaissance, partisan groups behind enemy lines, and Soviet agents. The British shared a warning based on an ultra-intercept, but it was heavily disguised to hide its origin. The Soviet spy John Cairncross provided much more detail. Nevertheless, repeated German delays caused uncertainty in Moscow. General Feldmarschall von Manstein wanted the operation to start in early May, after the spring rains. However, Hitler, unusually anxious, caused further delays. The Führer was putting nearly all their resources on the line with this massive gamble. He aimed to shorten the front and regain control, hoping to reassure uncertain allies after the defeat at Stalingrad and the retreat from the Caucasus. Victory at Kursk will become a beacon for the whole world, Hitler declared in his order from April 15th. However, as the Allies claimed victory in Tunisia, he began to worry about the situation in Sicily and Italy. "Thinking about this attack puts a knot in my stomach," he confided to Guderian. Many high-ranking officers shared their own hesitations about the planned offensive. To make up for their smaller numbers, the German army had always relied on its hallmark strategy to conduct a war of movement. But the Kursk offensive seemed likely to turn into a battle of attrition. In chess, losing several pieces means the risks increase the moment you lose the initiative and try to launch an attack again. The German army's key force, its armored units, was about to engage in a battle that would pose greater dangers for them than for the Red Army, which now had a clear advantage in numbers and equipment. Staff officers from the OKW began expressing their concerns about Operation Citadel, but oddly, this only strengthened Hitler's resolve to proceed. The planning for the operation gained an uncontrollable momentum. Hitler felt he could not retreat. He dismissed air reconnaissance reports regarding the Soviet defenses, claiming they were inflated. Yet, despite Manstein's wishes for an early strike, Citadel was repeatedly delayed to allow more tanks, including the new Mark V Panther, to reach the front after delays caused by Royal Air Force bombing. Ultimately, the major offensive did not commence until July 5th. This extra time allowed the Red Army to prepare effectively. Their forces, along with about 300,000 mobilized civilians, set to work on constructing 8 lines of defense, which included deep tank ditches, underground bunkers, minefields, wire obstacles, and over 9,000 kilometers of trenches. Every soldier, in classic Soviet fashion, was given a goal of digging 5 meters of trench each night, as it was too hazardous during daylight. In some areas, the defensive positions stretched nearly 300 kilometers back. All civilians residing within 25 kilometers of the front who were not involved in the digging process were evacuated. Nighttime reconnaissance patrols were dispatched to capture German soldiers for interrogation. These snatch parties were made up of men chosen for their size and strength. Their job was to overpower a sentry or a ration carrier. Each reconnaissance group was assigned a couple of engineers. These engineers would guide them through the mines and clear a path in the German minefield. A significant strategic reserve, called the Steppe Front and led by Colonel General 1S Konev, was put together behind the bulge. This reserve included the 5th Guards Tank Army, 5 rifle armies, 3 additional tank and mechanized corps, and 3 cavalry corps. In total, the Steppe Front gathered close to 575,000 troops. They received support from the 5th Air Army. The movements and positions of these forces were kept hidden to mislead the Germans regarding the Red Army's preparations for a major counterattack. Additional deception tactics involved concentrating other forces in the south and building dummy airfields to suggest an offensive in that area. Usually, an attacking force needs to have a 3-to-1 advantage over defenders. However, in July 1943, that situation was flipped. The Soviet army groups involved, Rokossovsky's Central Front, Vatutin's Voronezh Front, Malinovsky's Southwestern Front, and Konev's Steppe Front, numbered over 1,900,000 soldiers. In contrast, the German forces for Operation Citadel did not exceed 780,000. This was a substantial risk. The Germans relied on armored formations, using companies of Tiger tanks as the frontline assault to punch through Soviet defenses. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps, which had captured Kharkov and Belgorod in March, was in the process of re-equipping. The 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, reinforced its ranks mainly with ground personnel from the Luftwaffe and conducted an intensive training program. At this time, SS Untersturmführer Michael Wittmann took command of his 1st Tiger platoon. Despite the clear advantages of the Tiger tank, the Waffen-SS Panzergrenadier divisions were well aware of their limitations in equipment. The SS Das Reich had to outfit one of its companies with captured T-34 tanks. Ultra-intelligence, relayed by Cairncross to the Soviet Foreign Intelligence Department through his contact in London, also pinpointed the Luftwaffe airfields in the area. Around 2,000 aircraft were gathered at that location. This was the majority of what remained on the Eastern Front, after many squadrons were redirected to protect Germany from the Allied air forces. The Red Army's aviation regiments took advantage of this situation and launched surprise attacks in early May, reportedly destroying over 500 aircraft while they were still on the ground. The Luftwaffe faced a lack of aviation fuel, limiting its capacity to support the troops on the attack. German supply issues were exacerbated by the intense partisan activities occurring far behind the lines of the Wehrmacht. In certain regions, like the forests south of Leningrad and large areas of Belarusia, partisan forces had nearly complete control. These groups were now being coordinated from Moscow. The German anti-partisan operations escalated in brutality. SS Brigade Führer Oskar Dirlewanger and his recruits, who were released criminals, ruthlessly exterminated and burned entire villages. For the German Kursk offensive, Soviet partisans were prepared to target railway lines to disrupt supply routes. The repeated delays of the German offensive led some leaders, like Colonel General Vatudin, to become restless. They believed the Red Army should take action and initiate their own attack. Zhukov and Vasilevsky had to reassure Stalin that patience was necessary. They explained they could defeat many more Germans with fewer losses in defense than in an assault. Stalin was in a foul mood, having learned from Winston Churchill in early June that the Allied invasion of northern France had been delayed until May of the following year. He was also resentful about the international controversy sparked by the mass killing of Polish prisoners of war in the forests of Katy and elsewhere. In late April, upon discovering the mass grave, the Germans called for an international team of doctors from Allied and occupied countries to investigate. The Polish government in exile, based in London, demanded a thorough inquiry from the International Red Cross. Stalin asserted with anger that the Germans were responsible for the killings, and that anyone who questioned this was aiding and abetting Hitler. On April 26, Moscow cut off diplomatic ties with the London Polish government. The death of General Sikorsky on July 4th was the result of a tragic accident, when the cargo inside the Liberator he was aboard shifted during takeoff. After the news about Katie and Sikorsky's calls for a full inquiry, the Polish people naturally suspected sabotage. On May 15th, Joseph Stalin made an announcement. He sought to reassure Britain, and particularly the United States, which provided critical support through Lend-Lease. He declared that he had disbanded the Comintern. However, this was also a tactic to shift focus from the controversy surrounding the Katy killings. The Comintern, led by Georgi Dimitrov, Dmitry Manuilsky, and Palmiro Togliatti, continued to function under the international section of the Central Committee. On the hot and humid afternoon of July 4th, with sporadic rain, German Panzergrenadier units from the Grossdeutschland and the 11th Panzer Division began their probing attacks against the forward Soviet positions in the southern Belgorod sector. That night, German engineer units from Model's 9th Army began to cut wires and clear mines in the northern sector. A German soldier was captured and interrogated. This information reached General Rokossovsky, the commander of the Central Front, indicating that H. Hauer was set for 3 in the morning. He quickly ordered a significant harassing bombardment that included guns, heavy mortars, and Katyusha rocket launchers aimed at Model's 9th Army. Georgy Zhukov called Stalin to inform him that the battle had commenced. Vatutin's forces on the southern flank, after interrogating a German prisoner, began their preemptive fire against Hoth's 4th Panzer Army shortly after. Both the 9th Army and the 4th Panzer Army felt compelled to postpone their attacks by up to 2 hours. They began to suspect the Soviets might be planning their own offensive. Although the Germans experienced relatively few casualties from this shelling, they realized that the Red Army was prepared for their advance. Coupled with a fierce thunderstorm, this was not a promising start. As dawn arrived, Red Army aviation initiated preemptive strikes against German airfields, but these were largely empty of aircraft. The Luftwaffe had already taken off, leading to a fierce air battle that favored the German pilots. With the command Panzer March, the armored units began their advance at 5 o'clock in the morning. In the southern sector, Hoth's formations included Tigers and massive assault guns at the front, with Panthers and Panzer IVs on the sides, followed by infantry troops. The Panthers, which had been quickly sent from production lines in Germany, soon showed mechanical issues, with many catching fire. Even though fewer than 200 Tiger tanks were involved in Operation Citadel, out of a total of 2,700 tanks, they still served as a powerful force. German morale seemed to be high. A Fahnenjunker in a flak battalion expressed confidence, writing, "I believe the Russians will receive a very heavy beating this time." Meanwhile, an Unteroffizier in the 19th Panzer Division remarked that the explosions and downed Soviet fighters would create a wonderful image for the newsreels, though probably few would believe it. To keep spirits high, officers shared another hopeful thought. They noted that Joseph Stalin was becoming frustrated with England due to the absence of a second front. A soldier in the 36th Infantry Division wrote, "If something does not happen soon, he will make a peace offer to us." Hoth launched his attack on the southern sector with three main thrusts. On the left, the 3rd and 11th Panzer Divisions flanked the Grossdeutschland Panzer Grenadier Division. In the center, he deployed Obergruppenführer Paul Hauser's 2nd SS Panzer Corps, which included the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, the Das Reich, and the Totenkopf Panzer Grenadier Divisions. On the right side, the 6th, 19th, and 7th Panzer Divisions advanced as part of the 3rd Panzer Corps. Army Detachment Kempf was positioned to their right rear, attacking south of Belgorod while trying to cross the northern Donets River. In the north, Model's central advance toward Ponyri featured two Panzer Corps, each led by a Tiger battalion and large Elephant self-propelled guns, also known as Ferdinands. The open terrain ahead, dotted with a few woods and farming hamlets, seemed ideal for tanks. However, the panzer crews soon discovered it was challenging to locate the hundreds of concealed anti-tank guns. These guns were positioned by the forward Red Army divisions, which were ordered to sacrifice themselves while absorbing the shock of the German armored advances in a battle of attrition. Heavy artillery shells had been buried in front of many positions to be detonated remotely. Above, the ungainly gull-winged Stukas with sirens blaring dove onto Soviet positions and fortified T-34 tanks. The Stuka ace Hans Rudel tested his own creation, a cannon bird, equipped with two 37mm guns attached under the wings. Other T-34 tanks, poorly disguised as haystacks, were quickly dealt with. Crew members who survived the impact of the armor-piercing shells had to quickly escape through the burning straw. German soldiers were excited by the results. A Hauptfeldwebel in the 167th Infantry Division wrote home, saying, "Our Luftwaffe is truly impressive. Once the enemy is hit, our panzer forces can move at full speed." However, Soviet anti-tank guns were better hidden. Experienced crews often waited until a tank was within 20 meters before firing. In the northern sector, just west of Ponyri, where the Tigers broke through, Vasily Grossman noted that the 45mm anti-tank shells struck the tanks but bounced off like peas. He mentioned that some artillerymen had even gone mad after witnessing this. The situation was similarly grim in the southern sector. One gun layer fired at a Tiger from close range using a 45mm gun. The shells bounced off, causing the gun layer to lose his composure and throw himself at the Tiger. Although most anti-tank shells failed to penetrate the heavy frontal armor of the Tigers, their tracks were susceptible to mines. With remarkable courage, Soviet sappers rushed in with spare anti-tank mines to place in the tank's path. Red Army soldiers also advanced stealthily to throw grenades, satchel charges, and Molotov cocktails. Fearing a breakthrough to the west of Ponyri, Rokossovsky dispatched anti-tank, artillery, and mortar brigades. He also called for support from fighters in the 16th Air Army to counter the German bombers and Messerschmitts, but they suffered heavy losses. German commanders were surprised to discover they had not achieved any surprise and that Soviet soldiers were not retreating under their armored attack. Despite significant casualties, the German spearheads pushed forward nearly 10 kilometers on a 15-kilometer front. Rokossovsky ready to counterattack for the following day, but coordinating forces amidst the chaos of the expansive battlefield was challenging. The air battle overhead was just as brutal, with the German 6th Air Fleet and the Soviet 16th Air Army deploying nearly every operational aircraft available. Focke-Wulfs, Stukas, and Messerschmitts engaged with Sturmovix, Yaks, and Lavochkins. At times, desperate Soviet pilots resorted to ramming German aircraft. The aerial conflict over Hoth's 4th Panzer Army in the southern section of the salient was even fiercer. The Luftwaffe's 4th Air Fleet, having narrowly escaped a preemptive strike by Soviet forces at dawn, dealt heavy losses to its assailants. The Kursk campaign has often been depicted as the largest tank battle in history, sometimes with inflated figures. However, the aerial combat during this period was among the fiercest of the Second World War. In the south, the Grossdeutschland division got stuck in a minefield that became dangerously muddy due to a storm the night before. Pioneer battalions that were sent in to assist the tanks faced heavy fire. Only a desperate charge by the Panzer Grenadiers on foot succeeded in clearing the Soviet defenses around the minefield. Even so, it took many hours to free the tanks and create safe paths through the perilous area. To further diminish German morale, a brigade of new Panther tanks brought in for support began to suffer from mechanical failures. This issue affected more than just the Panthers. An Unteroffizier in the 4th Panzer Division complained, stating, "My division is already going to the dogs. There are many breakdowns with the half-tracks and the tanks are no better. The Tigers are not the true love either." Nonetheless, the advance continued. Rishat Zevedinovich Sadradinov, a Tatar serving in an anti-aircraft battery, witnessed all 4 of his guns getting destroyed by Stukas. The tall rye around them was ablaze. The gun crews sought shelter in earth bunkers, while the German tanks moved past. When the Red Army soldiers eventually emerged, they found themselves far behind the front line. Sadradinov and his comrades took the uniforms off dead German soldiers and wore them over their own. As they neared the Soviet front line, sentries challenged them. Once the Red Army soldiers realized they were Russians dressed in German uniforms, they shouted, "Ah, you bastards! You're Vlasov men!" And they were beaten severely. Sadradinov and his companions finally managed to prove their identities by contacting the chief of staff of their division. Nikifor Dmitrievich Shavola, the commander of the 27th Anti-Tank Brigade assigned against the Grossdeutschland, reported, "The Luftwaffe was bombing us. We were amidst the fire and smoke, yet my men went wild. They kept firing without heed to the chaos." Messerschmitt fighters, referred to as Messers by the Red Army soldiers, strafed the trenches relentlessly. Even after sustaining injuries, the soldiers rarely returned to dressing stations. There was constant thunder, the ground shook, and fire surrounded them. They shouted in the turmoil, while the Germans attempted to disrupt their radio communications. They shouted over the radio, "I am Nekrasov! I am Nekrasov!" I yelled back, "That's nonsense! You are not! Go away!" They drowned out our words with their howling. Trofim Karpovich Teplenko, a gun layer, described it as face-to-face battle. He said it felt like a duel with anti-tank guns versus tanks. Sergeant Smirnov had his head and legs blown off. We retrieved the head and the legs, placing them in a small ditch and covering them up. Dust from the black earth and smoke from the gunpowder turned our food a dull gray, assuming any rations had arrived. During the brief lulls in the fighting, the men struggled to find sleep in the quiet. Lieutenant Colonel Shavola noted, "The quieter it is, the more tense it feels." To the east, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, supported by a Nebelwerfer rocket launcher brigade, attacked Nekrasov's 52nd Guards Rifle Division. Behind the leading tanks, flamethrower teams advanced to clear bunkers and trenches. Their mission was almost suicidal, as they immediately drew enemy fire. But if they succeeded, the flames left the awful smell of burnt flesh and fuel. The Leibstandarte to the left moved the farthest towards Prokhorovka, while Das Reich and Totenkopf advanced northeastward on their right. Even the Leibstandarte was stopped in its tracks later that evening by another anti-tank brigade sent to reinforce the line. 30 kilometers to the southeast, Army Detachment Kempf crossed the River Donets southeast of Belgorod, but only achieved minor successes. Their goal of moving forward to secure Hoth's right flank was clearly going to be challenging. The German tank crews, especially the loaders, often suffered from heat exhaustion on that scorching day. The Tigers were modified to hold 120 of their 88mm shells instead of 90. With so many targets available, the loaders worked quickly in the stifling turret, wearing down with fatigue. Sometimes their tanks needed to be restocked 2 or 3 times in a single day, and stowing the shells was tiring, even with assistance. A German war correspondent assigned to a Tiger company was nearly driven crazy by the noise in his headphones, the constant thumping of machine guns and the heavy rumble of the main guns. Vatutin, who had focused mainly on his anti-tank units on the first day of fighting, began to deploy Lieutenant General Katakov's 1st Tank Army along with 2 Guards Tank Corps to bolster the 2nd Major defensive line. Although he faced criticism for using these armored reserves defensively instead of launching a significant counterattack, Vatutin was likely justified in his decision. A large assault across open ground would have left them vulnerable to the Tiger tanks. The Tigers, armed with 88mm guns, could destroy Soviet T-34 tanks from nearly 2 kilometers away, long before they were able to engage the German panzers. One Tiger crew managed to take out 22 Soviet tanks in less than an hour, an accomplishment that earned its commander an immediate Knight's Cross. On July 6th, while the Grossdeutschland division struggled with the swampy terrain and fierce resistance on the left, the Leibstandarte advanced further north alongside Das Reich, breaking through the 2nd line of defense. However, their flanks were left unprotected, and the Soviet pressure from the west forced them to divert from their northern advance. This push led them northeast toward the railway junction of Prokhorovka. Meanwhile, Model's 9th Army units in the northern sector were enduring heavy losses. The infantry, including the Panzer Grenadiers, lagged behind the armored divisions. Soviet infantry, hidden from sight, ambushed the imposing Elephant self-propelled guns, while sappers continued to place mines in their way. To the Germans' dismay, these giants did not instill tank panic, or Panzerschreck, in the Soviet ranks. During the tank battle near Ponyri Station on July 7th, chaos reigned as everything burned, including both vehicles and people. Almost every house and village within miles had been reduced to rubble. Red Army soldiers were appalled by the sight of severely burned tank crewmen being carried past. One lieutenant, who was wounded in the leg and had lost a hand, was leading a battery that came under tank attack. Once the enemy advance was halted, he took his own life rather than live as a cripple. The fear of mutilation was profound among Red Army soldiers. This fear was not unfounded, especially given how their injured comrades were treated. Limbless veterans were cruelly referred to as samovars. Model understood that despite his forces pushing over a dozen kilometers in one sector west of Ponyri, the Soviet defensive lines were proving much more formidable than they had anticipated. Rokossovsky shared these concerns. His tank counterattack, planned for dawn, did not work out as intended. All he could do was order his troops into hull-down positions to bolster the line. This was fortunate, as Model had chosen to commit his main reserve in a last-ditch effort to break through. The fierce fighting in the north lasted until the night of July 8th, wearing down Model's armored units. Despite the heavy losses inflicted on the defenders, the Red Army's advantage in numbers of tanks and anti-tank guns was overwhelming. Their Sturmovik ground attack aircraft also began to inflict significant damage on German tanks and assault guns. Model's 9th Army suffered approximately 20,000 casualties and lost around 200 tanks. Once it became apparent that the enemy attack was slowing, Rokossovsky and General Popov from the Bryansk front began preparations for their counterattacks against the Orel salient scheduled for July 10th. This operation was named Kutuzov, after the esteemed Russian commander from 1812. On the southern end of the Kursk salient, Vatutin's forces faced a serious threat. The Stavka expected the Germans to focus their main effort on the northern flank, but the assault came from the south instead, led by Hoth's 4th Panzer Army. The German advance toward Prokhorovka, spearheaded by the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, appeared likely to succeed, even against Katakov's 1st Guards Tank Army, which was rushed into defense. On the evening of July 6th, Vatutin, with support from General Vasilevsky, the Stavka representative, urgently requested reinforcements from Moscow. The situation was so dire that Konev's steppe front was ordered to prepare for a forward move. Lieutenant General Pavel Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army was immediately assigned to assist Vatutin. Following Stalin's personal directive, the 2nd Air Army was to cover the 300-kilometer march during daylight, as the dust stirred up by the tank columns would quickly draw the attention of the Luftwaffe. The 5th Guards Tank Army began its march in the early hours of July 7th, with its advancing formation stretching about 30 kilometers wide across the steppe. By midday, Rotmistrov noted, the dust rose in thick clouds, settling heavily on the roadside bushes, grain fields, tanks, and trucks. The dark red sun was barely visible. An endless flow of tanks, self-propelled guns, artillery tractors, armored personnel carriers, and trucks moved forward. The soldiers' faces were grimy with dust and exhaust fumes. The heat was unbearable. Soldiers suffered from extreme thirst, and their sweat-drenched shirts clung to their skin. The fierce battle on the southern front of the Kursk salient raged on July 7th, marked by an intense and selfless defense by Soviet rifle divisions, tank brigades, and anti-tank units of the 6th Guards and 1st Guards Tank Army. Hoth's forces discovered that for every division they destroyed, another would appear right behind to block their advance. There was no time to bury the dead, and the bodies lay infested with flies. Men from both sides were driven to madness by fear, stress, and the horrific sounds of battle. One German soldier even began dancing the can-can until his comrades pulled him back to reality. At one moment, it seemed that the Grossdeutschland division was on the verge of breaking through toward Oboyan. But they encountered a brigade from the 6th Tank Corps that had been redeployed just in time. The SS Leibstandarte and Das Reich divisions pushed along the road toward Pokrovka on the eastern flank of the 6th Guards Army, but they faced constant counterattacks on their vulnerable sides. Luftwaffe pilots managed to shoot down many Soviet aircraft. The ace pilot, Erich Hartmann, downed 7 that day, ultimately becoming the highest-scoring pilot of the war with 352 victories. The Red Army aircrew also had successes, destroying about 100 fighters and bombers in the southern sector. The Luftwaffe, focused on ground support, could not engage as many enemy aircraft as desired, and a severe fuel shortage forced them to limit their sorties. The Soviets began to establish air superiority for the first time in this battle, bombing German airfields each night. Despite heavy losses, a pilot from Rudel's unit noted that they were in the air again before dawn. He expressed their determination with an unbroken Stuka spirit, we plunged our birds on the enemy and hurled our destruction-laden bombs. On July 8th, Hauser moved the SS Totenkopf division from the right flank of his Panzer Corps to the left to help redirect their advance away from Prokhorovka and back toward Oboyan on the main road to Kursk. As the Corps was redeploying, the Soviet 10th Tank Corps launched an attack. However, the assault was so disorganized that it was repelled with heavy losses. The Soviet 2nd Tank Corps, tasked with hitting the vulnerable side of the SS Panzer Corps, suffered heavy losses from Henschel HS-109 aircraft equipped with 30mm cannons. Hauser's divisions reported destroying 121 Soviet tanks that day, a figure that might have included Luftwaffe claims. On July 9th, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps launched an assault on Vatutin's final line of defense. One Soviet defender from the 6th Guards Army noted how well those in SS camouflage uniforms fought. He witnessed a Tiger tank taking out 7 T-34s in rapid succession. Despite their exhaustion, the panzer crews relied on Pervitin pills to keep awake and numb their sense of danger. Hauser hoped for support on his right flank, but Army Detachment Kempf was still facing stiff resistance east of Belgorod. At the same time, General Shumilov's 7th Guards Army posed a threat to that flank. An SS Totenkopf Panzer Grenadier Regiment reached the River Psel, yet the advance of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps was hampered by Soviet divisions defending the 6th Guards Army and the 1st Guards Tank Army. Later that afternoon, German command reversed Hauser's direction of advance. turning it back towards Prokhorovka. They hoped Army Detachment Kempf would achieve a quicker northward advance, but Kempf's divisions faced constant assaults on both sides. On July 10th, the same day the Allies invaded Sicily, the 1st Tank Army, along with remnants of the 6th Guards Army, continued to slow the attacks on the Oboyan Axis at a significant cost. This engaged General Otto von Knobelsdorff's XL-8 Panzer Corps, preventing them from helping Hausser's push towards Prokhorovka. The Grossdeutschland unit was completely worn out, yet its Panzer Grenadiers managed to capture 2 critical hills, led by Hyacinth Graf Strachwitz, known as the Panzer Cavallerist, who had previously reached the Volga north of Stalingrad. Although Oboyan was visible through binoculars, they felt they would never reach it. For Strachwitz, this must have evoked a sense of déjà vu. Back in 1914, his cavalry patrol had been close to Paris, only to face a French counterattack at the Marne. Hausser's SS divisions did not advance as swiftly towards Prokhorovka as intended, mainly due to many regiments embroiled in battles all around them. The Leibstandard advanced with a portion of Das Reich despite intense artillery fire. The SS Totenkopf crossed the River Selle 5 kilometers to the left, but faced a tough Soviet defense on a hill ahead, which blocked its route up the valley to the northeast. The ground had dried out considerably. A medic wrote home, saying, "It's very hot here, and the roads are knee-deep in dust. You should see my face. It's covered with dust a millimeter thick." Stuka pilots continued their relentless attack sorties. A lieutenant noted, "In 5 days, I have completed 30 combat missions, bringing my total to 285. He mentioned that they were playing a crucial role in the large tank battles. On July 11th, Vatutin repositioned his defense line southwest of Prokhorovka, bringing in fresh divisions from the 5th Guards Army to block the advance of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps. Kempf, under heavy pressure from Manstein for a breakthrough, deployed his Tigers from the 503rd Heavy Panzer Battalion and the 6th Panzer Division to overcome the defenses of 2 Soviet rifle divisions. An Obergefreiter in the 6th Panzer shared that they had spent 5 consecutive days in their tanks. "The Russians are keeping us busy. In the past 3 months, they have built a defense line like nothing we have ever encountered." The 19th Panzer Division also advanced north on the opposite bank of the Donets, toward Prokhorovka. Vatutin recognized this threat and was closely monitored by Marshal Vasilevsky, who maintained constant communication with Stalin. He instructed General Rotmistrov to deploy his 5th Guards Tank Army as soon as it arrived. However, that evening, during a reconnaissance visit to the front with Vasilevsky, Rotmistrov used his binoculars and spotted German tanks in the distance. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps had launched a sudden advance and reached the location from which Rotmistrov planned to initiate his counterattack the following day. He rushed back in his Lend-Lease Jeep to revise the plans. He and his staff worked through the night creating new orders. At 4 a.m. on July 12th, Rotmistrov received word from Vatutin that the 6th Panzer Division was nearing the River Donets at Rzhavets. This indicated that Army Detachment Kempf was outflanking the Soviet 69th Army, posing a threat to the rear of his 5th Guards Tank Army. A Kampfgruppe from the 6th Panzer Division had already maneuvered through the darkness and reached Rzhavets, utilizing a captured T-34 as the lead vehicle. Even though Red Army engineers destroyed the road bridge over the Donets River, a footbridge remained intact amidst the chaos. This allowed the Panzer Grenadiers to cross the river by dawn. A Kampfgruppe from the 19th Panzer Division raced to reinforce them, but the Luftwaffe was not informed of the success at Rzhavets. A group of Heinkel 111 bombers struck the bridgehead, injuring General Major Walther von Hunersdorf, the commander of the 6th Panzer Division, and Oberst Hermann von Oppeln-Bronikowski, the leader of the Kampfgruppe. To counter this threat near Rzhavets, Vatutin ordered Rotmistrov to redirect his reserve forces as a blocking unit during that chaotic night. To the west of Prokhorovka, Knobelsdorff's XL-18 Panzer Corps planned another attack towards Oboyan. In response, Vatutin called for a preemptive strike using tank brigades from the 1st Tank Army and the 22nd Guards Rifle Corps. Hoth's forces were weary. They started the offensive with 916 panzers, but now they had fewer than 500 left. Heavy rain had turned the thick dust into a muddy mess, making movement tougher for the Germans than for the Soviets, who had the broad-track T-34s. On July 12th, shortly after dawn, General Rotmistrov arrived at the command post bunker of the 29th Tank Corps in a hillside orchard. This location overlooked the wheat fields below and the railway line southeast of Prokhorovka. All his revised orders for the counterattack were distributed, and the massed artillery and Katyusha units had redeployed during the early hours. Beyond the fields lay a forest where part of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps was hidden. The clear sky was soon cloaked in storm clouds, signaling more heavy rain ahead. The battle commenced with Stuka attacks. Yak and Lavochkin fighters from the 2nd Air Army quickly appeared to engage them, followed by Soviet bombers. Their assault was supported by the thunder of artillery and the piercing wail of Katyusha rocket batteries, setting the wheat fields ablaze. When the 2nd SS Panzer Corps moved from the forest's edge into the open, Rotmistrov signaled with the code word "Stahl, Stahl, Stahl" for his tanks to charge. Hidden on the rear slope of small hills, they sprang into action at the order of "Steel" and advanced at full speed. He had instructed them in his orders that their best chance against the Tigers was to engage closely and overwhelm them with numbers. Obersturmführer Rudolf von Ribbentrop, the son of the foreign minister, recalled the scene from the turret of his Tiger tank in the 1st SS Panzer Regiment. He said, "What I saw left me speechless. From beyond the slight rise about 150 to 200 meters ahead, I saw 15, then 30, then 40 tanks. Soon there were too many to count. The T-34 tanks were charging at us swiftly, with infantry on board. The battle resembled an ancient clash of armored knights. Neither artillery nor aircraft could assist either side due to the entangled forces. Control and formation were lost on both sides, leading to tank-on-tank combat at point-blank range. When ammunition and fuel exploded, tank turrets flew off. German gunners initially focused their attacks on command tanks since they were the only ones equipped with radios. Then, they targeted the large round fuel tanks mounted on the back of the T-34s. An Untersturmführer from the 2nd Panzergrenadier Regiment described, "They were around us, atop us, and between us. We fought man to man." All German advantages in communication, movement, and marksmanship were gone amidst the chaos, noise, and smoke. A Soviet tank driver noted, "The atmosphere was suffocating. I struggled to breathe, with sweat pouring down my face. The psychological pressure was overwhelming. We thought we would be killed at any moment." Those who remained alive and continued to fight hours later were astonished. "Tanks even rammed into each other," reported a Soviet observer. "The metal was burning." The combat zone was littered with charred armored vehicles, releasing columns of thick black smoke. Hoth's hopes that Army Detachment Kempf would flank Rotmistrov's 5th Guards tank army were crushed. It had been halted nearly 19 kilometers away, albeit narrowly, by Rotmistrov's reserve. The only apparent success was on Hoth's left, where the SS Totenkopf seemed poised to break through the 5th Guards army to the northeast of Prokhorovka. However, Soviet reinforcements arrived just in time to close the gap. Although Nobelsdorf's XL 18th Panzer Corps countered the preemptive attack prepared by Vatutin, this limited success came too late to create a breakthrough. As heavy rain started again at dusk, both sides withdrew to refuel and rearm. Medical teams worked to evacuate the wounded, while recovery teams moved through the battlefield at night. Several hundred tanks lay destroyed and burned. Even Zhukov, known for his ruthlessness, was affected by the scene when he visited the battlefield 2 days later. SS prisoners were executed without hesitation, knowing that their captors showed no mercy either. There was little regard for the dead. A young Soviet officer noted, "Germans were crushed by vehicles. There were heaps of dead Germans with map holders and all their belongings still on them. I saw tanks drive over their bodies." Hoth was unaware until that evening that to the north of the Kursk salient, the Red Army had launched Operation Kutuzov to reclaim Orel. Model's fatigued 9th Army and the 2nd Panzer Army were caught off guard by the scale of the assault. Once again, German intelligence had misjudged the Red Army's buildup of forces to the rear. General Ankecht Bagramian's 11th Guards Army struck Model's rear and advanced 16 kilometers in just 2 days. Building on that momentum, the 4th Tank Army, the 3rd Guards Tank Army, and even Rokossovsky's worn-out 13th Army began their own offensive. On July 13th, Hitler focused on the successful Allied invasion of Sicily just 3 days prior, called Generalfeldmarschall von Manstein and Generalfeldmarschall von Kluge to the Wolfschanze for a meeting. Manstein had ordered the 2nd SS Panzer Corps and Army Detachment Kempf to renew their attack, but Hitler revealed he needed to withdraw troops from the Eastern Front to defend Italy. Operation Citadel was immediately cancelled. He doubted the Italians' commitment to fight for Sicily, making Italy itself vulnerable to invasion. Manstein, aware that Hoth was in agreement, wished to continue the battle to stabilize the front. Some fierce fighting persisted. Army Detachment Kempf finally linked up with Hoth's forces, but on July 17th, the OKH ordered the 2nd SS Panzer Corps to be pulled back from the front for redeployment to Western Europe. The invasion of Sicily, while not the second front Stalin had envisioned, still had significant repercussions. On that same day, the Soviet southwestern and southern fronts launched coordinated attacks along the Donets and the Meuse down to the Sea of Azov. This operation aimed to distract German forces from Kharkov, which the Soviets intended to recapture. For a change, Stalin's call for a general offensive happened at the right moment. The Germans were unsettled by the array of fresh or rebuilt divisions that emerged, and by the Red Army's capability to initiate new attacks right after the intense Battle of the Kursk salient. A Stuka pilot, with misplaced sorrow, reflected, "This war has never been more horrific or cruel than now, and I see no end in sight." Meanwhile, Soviet sabotage of railway lines increased. On July 22nd, Adolf Hitler authorized Model to begin preparations for withdrawal from the Orel Bulge. The impact of the victory at Kursk was significant, prompting Stalin to make his only front visit during the entire war. On August 1st, a heavily guarded and disguised train transported him to the Western Front headquarters. He later traveled to the Kalinin Front to the north. However, since he did not engage with officers or soldiers, it seems his visit mainly served to boast to Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt. On August 3rd, Konev's Steppe Front and other armies from the Voronezh Front launched Operation Rumyantsev. This involved nearly 1 million soldiers, over 12,000 artillery pieces and Katyusha rocket launchers, along with almost 2,500 tanks and self-propelled guns. Erich von Manstein did not anticipate such a formidable attack arriving so quickly. For the exhausted German infantry, it felt as though their beaten foe had risen from the grave with renewed vigor. 2 days later, Belgorod was recaptured, allowing the Red Army to concentrate on Kharkov. On August 5th, Soviet troops also entered Orel, finding that the Germans had just withdrawn. Vasily Grossman, who vividly remembered the scenes of chaos in the city in 1941, arrived that afternoon. He noted, "The smell of burning hung in the air. A light blue, milky smoke rose from the fading fires. A loudspeaker unit blared the Internationale in the square. Red-cheeked girls, traffic controllers, waved their little red and green flags at every intersection." On August 18th, Bryansk was liberated. However, during that week, while Konev's forces moved toward Kharkov, the Germans mounted a counterattack. This time, the Red Army was prepared and responded fiercely. On August 28th, Kharkov fell at last after a fierce defense by Army Detachment Kempf, now rebranded as the 8th Army. Hitler had instructed that Kharkov be defended for as long as possible to reduce the demoralization of Germany's allies. The dire situation in Italy had unsettled him. He worried about how it would impact the Romanians and Hungarians. This was ironic because his push for the Kursk offensive aimed to impress these allies. The German army suffered heavy losses. Approximately 50,000 soldiers were killed, and several divisions were reduced to the size of a regiment or even smaller. However, the Red Army also paid a steep price for their victory. Zhukov's aggressive tactics during the Belgorod-Kharkov offensive resulted in over 250,000 casualties, surpassing the 177,000 men lost in the Kursk salient. The situation was even worse in Operation Kutuzov, which aimed to reclaim the Orel salient, leading to around 430,000 casualties. In total, the Red Army lost 5 armored vehicles for every German tank destroyed. Now, the Germans were forced to retreat to the line of the river Dnieper and begin withdrawing their remaining forces from the bridgehead on the Taman Peninsula. Hitler's dream of securing the Caucasus oil fields was shattered forever. Meanwhile, the Red Army had significantly improved its strength and experience, but it still had deep-seated issues. After the battle, Vasily Grossman met with Major General Gleb Baklanov, who commanded the 13th Guards Rifle Division. Baklanov noted that the soldiers now fought with intelligence and composure, as if they were working. However, he criticized the Red Army's planning processes and the many regimental commanders who either failed to verify essential details before an attack or misrepresented the position of their units. He believed the repeated call of "forward, forward" stemmed either from stupidity or fear of superiors, which resulted in unnecessary bloodshed. There was growing resentment within the German army following their loss of initiative at Kursk and Kharkov. The Nazi leadership became anxious and irritable. Still envious of the Soviet political officer system, they demanded that army officers assume the role of commissar. Yet they struggled to suppress the criticism of military leadership on the Eastern Front and the planning of Kursk. Hitler's delays in starting the operation to wait for the arrival of the Panthers clearly contributed to the scale of the disaster. However, it is uncertain whether it would have succeeded if it had been launched in May instead of July. German commanders at the front noted that soldiers wanted to know the truth about the overall situation. Their officers struggled to provide clear answers. General Oberst Otto Wöhler, the commander-in-chief of the 8th Army, observed after the fall of Kharkov that the warrior of 1943 was different from that of 1939. He recognized the serious nature of the struggle for the nation's survival. He rejected empty phrases and wanted to hear the facts in straightforward terms. Anything resembling propaganda was instinctively dismissed. Manstein, the commander-in-chief of Army Group South, fully supported this assessment. The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht attempted to shift the blame onto the 8th Army's new Chief of Staff, General Major Dr. Hans Speidel, depicting him as an intellectual, introspective researcher who focused on the negative and overlooked the positive. Wöhler strongly opposed this characterization, and Keitel swiftly prohibited any further correspondence on the matter. Keitel insisted that all officers show complete confidence in their leadership. Any signs of doubt were seen as defeatism, and any measures, no matter how harsh, were deemed acceptable to eliminate those who weakened national resolve. This war would not conclude with a peace treaty. It was about achieving victory or facing annihilation. The pompous Keitel was right to be wary, as Speidel was becoming a significant figure in the military resistance to Hitler and would play a crucial role in the July plot a year later.